My name is Lacey Holmes, and I will be exploring COVID-19's impact on adolescent self-esteem, its potential connection with depressive symptoms, and suggested support systems schools can utilize to help kids cope. To achieve this, I'm asking two research questions. The first is, how can schools create intervention and prevention strategies to support adolescents experiencing low self-esteem and/or depressive symptoms? And the second question asks, how intersectional framework can be used to better target prevention and intervention strategies to support all adolescents' mental health? As a high school teacher since 2015, I myself have noticed a change in student behavior, particularly as it relates to my perception of an adolescent's self esteem pre versus post COVID. This dip does seem particularly stark in girls, and this project gave me the opportunity to explore the potential connection between COVID, self esteem, and depressive symptoms. In my research, I've discovered that multiple studies seem to acknowledge that gender gap that I've anecdotally seen between boys and girls, having with boys having historically higher rates of self-esteem than girls during adolescence pre-COVID. However, there's minimal information exploring the intersection of stress and depressive symptoms as they relate to racial minority youth or adolescent members of the LGBTQIA plus community and self-esteem. My research questions are meant to examine the impact of COVID on an adolescent's self-esteem and expand the knowledge of that impact to be more inclusive of all identities an adolescent has. To do this effectively, I'm going to be using the intersectional framework, which is an idea created by Kimberly Crenshaw and is how I will view my research through. In a TED Talk that Ms. Crenshaw gave approximately 6 years ago, titled The Urgency of Intersectionality, she demonstrates her framework by asking the audience to stand as she reads a list of names. When a name is read that an audience member is unfamiliar with, she asks that they sit down. The first list of names are Black male victims of police violence, and the second are Black female victims of police violence. Significantly more people are able to stand during the list of Black male names than female names, which illustrates the principle of intersectionality because, in her words, we have police violence against Black Americans and violence against women as being two issues, known issues in American society. But as Ms. Crenshaw states, that if we don't have a pre-existing frame of reference for an issue, it can be difficult for us to conceptualize the issue. So while we have a frame for violence against Black Americans and violence against women, we need an intersectional lens to view an issue through multiple perspectives at once so that we're able to look at a situation and see it from a multitude of layers. And I'm going to be applying that principle of intersectionality to view self-esteem and the potential link of depressive symptoms through a similar multi-lens view, where we will look at the self-esteem of adolescents, of male adolescents, of female adolescents, of white adolescents, of non-white adolescents, of hetero adolescents, and of LGBTQIA plus adolescents, and seeing if there's a link to depressive symptoms. To do this, I have divided my presentation into three separate and distinct parts, where we begin with what we know about self-esteem pre-COVID. The next will be, what do we know or predict will happen to self-esteem and depressive symptoms in adolescents post-COVID? And then we'll end by asking how schools can implement appropriate and effective prevention and intervention strategies for all students. To investigate the impact of COVID on adolescent self-esteem, I've selected 3 peer-reviewed journal articles that examine 3 separate studies on this topic. One focuses on the development of self-esteem. Another focuses on the relationship between stress, depressive symptoms, and self-esteem. And the third focuses on environmental support, self-esteem, and mental health. However, before we dive into these studies, let's begin our analysis by looking at the definition of self-esteem, which Dr. Rosenberg defines as an individual's assessment of their worth and value. One consistent theme throughout my research is that Dr. Rosenberg is considered one of the foremost experts of self-esteem psychology. And Since then, other psychologists have contributed to his definition of self-esteem, and it has expanded into a construct that is considered to be fluid and dynamic and changing based on our experiences and ages and circumstances. However, during adolescence, the fluctuating nature of a self-esteem is considered particularly keen because a young person's sense of self changes constantly. Dr. Rosenberg's self-esteem scale is 10 items long, and it's self-graded on a scale from 0 to 3. And we consider 15 to be the threshold for what's known as quote unquote low self-esteem. So let's begin our dive into these studies by looking at the development of self-esteem in adolescents. This first study that we're examining is using 7 years of data that was collected from the Family Health Study to create a longitudinal study that was based in the upper Midwest of the US. Of that 7 years of data, researchers took a subset of the data to only include adolescents aged 10 to 16. So of that total, 51% were male and 51% were female and 49% were male. And of that total, 89% of the total adolescents were white, while the remaining 11% were African American, Asian, Hispanic, or Native American, further demonstrating the need for an increased focus on intersectionality when examining data. But the study is considered still to be fairly valid and reliable because of the high rate of retention at 95%. The survey also used Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, which is considered to be both reliable and valid, and it also used 2 others. One was the Junior High Life Experiences Survey, and the other was the Family Inventory of Life Events and Changes Survey. One was to measure stressful life events, and the other was to measure family relationships. Like I said, the studies we look at all affirm that there is a gender gap in self-esteem. And so you can see here that being confirmed that between 11 to 21, there is a major difference between male self-esteem and female self-esteem during adolescence. However, stressful life events are also something that are determined from this study to have had a significant impact on self-esteem, which is why this could be of potential interest to COVID, which is, obviously a stressful life event. So stressful life events also impact self-esteem. But when we're thinking about that, we want to take age into account, because when we're considering the stress that adolescents face because of their age, they're often lacking in what they can control, which is also something that harms their self-esteem during times of stress. So that lack of control necessitates feelings of strong support from the adults around them, like their family or teachers or counselors. And this study furthermore suggests that female self-esteem is going to be more impacted than male self-esteem during times of stress, which researchers seem to theorize was because of differences in how male and female adolescents respond to stress. Observationally, it seemed that girls tended to internalize their stress, whereas boys tended to be more emotive and at times even aggressive. So that socialization difference between the traditional expectations of boys and girls is suspected of playing a role in this finding. And so future research should definitely continue exploring that idea and how socialization of gender roles impacts self-esteem. Additionally, strong feelings of family support and relationships strengthen self-esteem. So the data collected from the study suggests that it is because of the love and support from family members who instilled confidence and esteem in young kids that when they approached adolescence, they were able to maintain a higher level of self-esteem. However, I do want to point out that family is not necessarily a buffering mechanism between a stressful life event and self-esteem. Instead, it's something that either can set you up well or not well when approaching adolescence. In other words, if you experience support, then you likely have love and confidence instilled in you, which makes you inherently have a higher sense of self-esteem, which can make it easier to maintain a higher sense of self-esteem throughout your adolescence. However, that's not something that necessarily causes fluctuation during adolescence. So before we move on, one important point to note is that the gender gap in self-esteem is seen across individuals. But when we analyze things like stress and family relationships, that can vary dramatically across individuals, even though gender-based trends are still evident within those individual variations. Moving on to our second study, where we look at the relationship between stress, self-esteem, and depressive symptoms. These findings are going to come from a study that was conducted in Norway and was written about in an article titled "The Association Between Stress, Self-Esteem, and Depressive Symptoms in Adolescence," published in 2016. In this article, the gender gap of self-esteem was found, and it also had another similarity to the previous study in that young children did experience less stress, and so they had higher levels of purported self-esteem, but as they approached adolescence, their stress seemed to go up and their self-esteem seemed to go down. So the main idea of these findings is that there is a loose association between self-esteem, stress, and depressive symptoms during adolescence, which does add a new layer to the fallout of low self-esteem for us to consider. The cross-sectional study that was collected in Norway took a sample of 634 girls and 603 boys aged between 13 to 18 years old and assessed their stress using the Adolescent Stress Questionnaire and assessed their depressive symptoms using a non-clinical depression scale that incorporated components of the DSM-4 as well as the Zung self-rating depression scale, though it was unique to this research study. And then for self-esteem, they used the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. And what they found was that there are associations between self-esteem, depressive symptoms, and stress, where self-esteem is inversely related to depressive symptoms and stress. So as your self-esteem goes up, your depressive symptoms and stress go down. But when your depressive symptoms and stress, go up, your self-esteem goes down. And self-esteem is positively correlated with coping mechanisms. So if you have strong coping mechanisms, you likely have a stronger sense of self-esteem. But if you don't have as strong of coping mechanisms, you likely have a weaker sense of self-esteem. When we compare these correlations drawn between depressive symptoms and self-esteem in boys and girls, survey results also confirmed a widely held belief that during adolescence, boys have a higher sense of self-esteem than girls. This is noted in differences in how the two genders responded to stress, which I discussed earlier, where girls tended to internalize and boys tended to be more emotive. But an additional consideration could be that perhaps the internal measuring stick used to respond to these survey scales, differ between genders. Ultimately, though, what this study from Norway shows is that stress can be a precursor to either low self-esteem or depressive symptoms, and self-esteem can also be a precursor to depressive symptoms. So similar to the study that was conducted in the Upper Midwest with family not necessarily buffering against stress, it is also worth noting that self-esteem is not necessarily going to buffer against stress either. However, it can create interventions that target improving self-esteem and coping strategies, which are valuable to improving an adolescent's mental health and is worth further exploration from researchers. Finally, in the third study, we're going to look at school connectedness, teacher support, and depressive symptoms. And this study comes from the Child and Youth Services Review, and they take data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, where they examine the association between school connectedness, teacher support, and depressive symptoms across 11,852 adolescents that were in grades between 7 and 12. This study is more inclusive of an individual adolescent's multiple identities, as evidenced by tables 5 and 6. But we still need more literature exploring the intersectionality of minority stress and depressive symptoms. However, the study does find that there is an association between school connectedness and depression, as well as teacher support and depression in adolescence, which are both going to show a correlation, meaning that students who reported feeling fewer depressive symptoms often felt higher levels of school connectedness and or teacher support. And though feeling cared about by your teacher, especially in girls, had a positive impact in self-esteem. Ultimately, while the first three studies that we mentioned and reviewed were limited in their perspective of adolescents tending to focus only on gender differences when examining self-esteem, depressive symptoms, and stress, this fourth almost bonus study titled Which Girls, Which Boys, the Intersectional Risk for Depression by Race, Ethnicity, and Gender, reviewed 25 additional studies that tried to link the effects of marginalization with depressive symptoms. And given the link between depressive symptoms and self-esteem, I found this to be of relevance to the conversation. The findings that were reported across the 25 studies had a pretty wide-ranging variability. And so what the researchers did when evaluating these studies was rank them from 1 to 5, with 5 being the most adequate and 1 being the least. They only looked at the studies that were ranked 3 or higher, which were the 25 mentioned. So there were more they examined, but did not include. Only 3 were ranked at a 5, 1 was ranked at a 4, and the remaining 21 were given 3s. When we look at those studies, what we're looking at is how gender is a significant predictor of depression across studies. And so overwhelmingly, when we think about it as a variable that's more closely aligned with biological sex rather than beliefs and behaviors of gender identity, it does have an impact. This suggests that we have a need for population-based studies that use identity-based racial or ethnic or gender measures, which is why we want to apply the intersectional framework towards these research questions. So here in this conceptual image, you can see how gender socialization and racial ethnic socialization contribute to someone's identity, which impacts their coping, which can lead to depression. And so coping and depression, high levels of coping equals high levels of self-esteem, low levels of depression equal high levels of self-esteem. So this can all be related to the questions, the 2 research questions at hand. And so when we're thinking about that from an intersectional lens, we want to predict and understand COVID's impact on adolescent students. So let's explore what's known and predicted with adolescents post-COVID. Since the previous study showed how stressful events increase depressive symptoms, and an increase in depressive symptoms lower self-esteem, and lower self-esteem leads to fewer coping skills, we want to prepare and support adolescent students by offering intervention and prevention strategies. So let's look, to best serve students, we want to look at what we know impacted them during COVID. What studies showed from before the pandemic into the first 6 months of the pandemic is that adolescent depression increased, but anxiety actually decreased. Now, symptoms of depression can be impacted by family support, friendship, or social connectedness, and it can impact your academic outcomes. There are individual differences amongst adolescents that we should take into account when looking at this, because while some adolescents were able to demonstrate resilience during the pandemic and have positive outcomes in all of these regards, they were likely set up to have more advantages to be able to demonstrate that resilience than others who were disadvantaged pre-pandemic, meaning they didn't have the same access to online or the internet, and maybe they came from low-income homes or they had learning and behavioral differences before the pandemic. Additionally, maybe they were experiencing family trauma during the pandemic. They saw family members die or lose their jobs or work high-risk jobs or perform essential work. And those had strong increases in depressive symptoms because of the negative ramifications of COVID. So we want to maintain that individualized perspective while looking at what is known about COVID. And furthermore, there is a disproportionate lack of access to mental health resources for historically marginalized populations that probably did exacerbate the problem. And these suggestions would indicate to researchers that we need to expand upon that data gathered and incorporate a more intersectional lens when viewing the impact of the pandemic on adolescent self-esteem and depressive symptoms. However, let's look at how things like family support impacted how kids responded to the pandemic. If parents were able to be emotionally supportive of their kids, then the adolescents were shown to be better adjusted to what the realities of the pandemic meant. However, if adolescents did not have that same supportive foundation, that could have led to maladaptive behaviors. And we want to take into account that, again, how family dynamics could have been disrupted as a result of the pandemic, which would create new sources of stress that would require new coping mechanisms for kids to create. Now, let's look at how friendships could have been a source of support or a lack of support. Students who were disadvantaged pre-COVID economically and lacked access to perhaps the internet would be more likely to experience loneliness because they would have had less access to things like social media in a similar way to their peers, which could have led to more depressive symptoms. And then academically, some students did do better in the pandemic than others. And those who identified as dealing with loneliness or depressive symptoms were more likely to struggle and say they have academic burnout, which is why we want to understand where kids are in terms of their mental health with depressive symptoms, stress, and self-esteem, so that we are able to support them as well as possible in the wake of COVID. Which is why I have created a survey based on all the information provided. The scales used in the survey are the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale and Beck's Depression Inventory. I also am incorporating the intersectional lens by going beyond just the gender question, but also including a racial and ethnic LGBTQIA perspective as well, and questioning students on how they view gender impacting self-esteem. Here are 4 questions from the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale, and here are 3 from the Beck's Inventory. At the end of my survey, I ask COVID-specific questions where I want kids to identify how they think their academic performance, friendship, health, and lifestyle were impacted by COVID based on that last research study we reviewed. I want to know, do their overall self-esteem increase or decrease or remain the same during the pandemic? And do they think that other students experience changes in self-esteem because of the pandemic? My hope for those surveys is that it will allow us to create intervention and prevention strategies. Intervention strategies would allow us to target our intervention by offering things like gender-based support to help build self-esteem and depressive coping strategies in adolescents so that they are able to respond to periods of stress like COVID better. I also want to provide immediate support to individuals whose survey results indicate low self-esteem and or higher rates of depressive symptoms. I also would like policy changes implemented that are going to allow for a faster connection between a disadvantaged adolescent in some way with mental health resources and reliable internet to reduce feelings of loneliness. And moving forward, we can continue to prevent teens and adolescents from experiencing high rates of stress, depression, and lower rates of self-esteem by having adults at school be trained for experiences adolescents are going through. And so I propose that we host trainings for teachers and other support staff so that they're able to quickly identify where students are struggling most and connect them with resources they need. I also think schools can be a place where social connectedness is encouraged and we are promoting more positive peer interactions, both virtually and in person, as well as at home with caregivers so that we are able to create secure attachments between kids and adults. These are samples of the scales used in my surveys. Again, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale and the Beck's depressive inventory scale, this is the entire scale of Rosenberg, but the inventory scale is actually 21 questions long, but very similarly graded 0 to 3. I want to thank you for taking time to view my presentation, and I hope that my survey results reveal better ways to support adolescents experiencing low self-esteem, stress, or depressive symptoms, and that we take that information to target coping strategies for students with multiple identities. And if people are disproportionately affected based on their identities, then we are able to be carefully trained in how to support them. I also want to call for more research that analyzes children with different identities in focus groups in psychologically safe settings with parental approval. And we need additional training in how to work on sensitive topics and situations so that if something as stressful as COVID or any other event happens, we are prepared to support adolescents and their self-esteem and depressive symptoms are not at risk. For your reference and potential interest in further exploration, here are a list of the resources that I used to create this presentation. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I have enjoyed discussing this important topic with you.